There was a tension in the air in the Cold War that we were living with an enemy.
Espionage is going on all the time.
The spy scare.
It was real, never mind witch hunts.
Hello, I'm Holly Doan. You're watching The 50s, a special series on a remarkable decade in Canada. It was a time of fear and betrayal. Canadians believed enemy agents were among us, and the country went to extraordinary lengths to find them. As you'll see, even a member of cabinet was recruited for counter-espionage. Was it a crisis or merely a witch hunt? Watch now as we present Spies.
It was a hidden world, the land of the Soviets. Few Canadians saw the USSR outside of newsreels. If there was to be war, people believed, it would start with Moscow.
That idea was spread, part of an effort to build up a kind of a war mentality in the West, that we're going to have to fight these people. Let's get ready.
James Sinclair, the smiling federal fisheries minister, in 1955 became the first Canadian cabinet member ever to visit Soviet Russia. Near the Kremlin, Sinclair said they put him up in a luxury hotel in a 5-room suite with a grand piano. Peter Worthington was a Moscow correspondent.
Everything was make-believe. And the only thing that really functioned well was the secret police system.
Sinclair was to attend a whaling conference in Moscow. He had another secret mission. Sinclair arranged to visit the long-closed Siberian islands of Kamchatka to see the fishing boats, he said. His daughter Margaret recalls.
Our family legend is that Dad, as Dad had told us, was that he had been given a camera and was asked to take some pictures of the naval vessels that were in the harbor, and take pictures if he saw any naval vessels. And so, because I guess everyone was interested in what their fleet was, so this was a chance. Nobody was ever up in Siberia. Dad was one of the first visitors up there, I would imagine.
In unpublished memoirs seen here for the first time, Sinclair wrote, Japanese had said the Russians were enlarging the hatches on big fishing vessels so they could lower a tank or an armored car to be used in an invasion. Sinclair brought a camera. Military intelligence had asked that he take pictures in Kamchatka's biggest harbor.
They were on a scaffold. It was about 20 feet up, and Dad pulled it. His camera was around his neck. He pulled his camera up and took a step forward and saying, "Oh, what a lovely view," to snap. And the police who were up on the scaffolding with him, the interpreter and all the other people who were there, reached for him with the camera to stop him from taking the picture, and the scaffolding tipped and they fell.
Sinclair was so badly hurt he had to be carried by chair and was treated by 16 doctors. To his death years afterward, Sinclair never spoke publicly of his spy mission to Siberia.
And Dad ripped out the pages of his diary where there would have been any real explanation, because he was very careful about keeping secrets.
Canada's Cold War started at this apartment house in Ottawa on Somerset Street. Here in 1945 lived a Russian defector, Igor Gazenko. He smuggled secret documents from the Soviet embassy. Gouzenko fled with his family, steps ahead of Soviet agents that broke into his apartment.
I actually went around the back and looked at the back stairs because I know that they played a part in my parents' defection. It was through those back stairs that my mother and my brother escaped, and my father told them to go in, and he watched what was happening. Then he joined them in the apartment across the hall and watched through the keyhole.
Gouzenko uncovered a spy ring. 15 people were arrested. They were Canadians accused of betraying secrets to the USSR. Newspaperman George Bremel.
Gouzenko gave the whole problem a face and a fact. It was real, never mind witch hunts. He has made this information available, and the authorities have been able to ascertain the depth of the threat.
The threat reached as far as Parliament. In the House of Commons, members learned one of their own was a spy.
The only real Soviet agent, professional, that we ever put in jail turned out to be a member of Parliament.
He was Fred Rose, a former electrician elected a 2-term MP for Cartier, Quebec. Rose was 20 years a communist organizer and pamphlet writer, an author of exposés. He was elected to the Commons in 1943. Rose moonlighted as a Soviet agent. At his trial, Rose was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He spent part of it in solitary confinement. Asked later by a friend if he'd do it all again, Rose replied, "Sure, what the hell?"
There's a degree of fundamentalism, a faith, and when you are faithful to a cause, you put aside the elements that might lead to disbelief. That was very strong amongst communists.
The defector Gouzenko, fearing for his life, would not show his face in public. Gouzenko was sentenced to death in absentia by the Soviet Supreme Court. His wife would not leave the house without placing newspapers in the front hall.
She described how she would place newspapers in a certain pattern so that if they were shifted, you would know that somebody had been through.
Espionage was a fact of life, Canadians were told. This Air Force training film warned of Soviet agents.
During war, security is pretty tight. So he tries to build up his information in peacetime, when security is more relaxed. This was true in the time of Igor Gouzenko, and it's true today. What we must not forget is that espionage is going on all the time.
People were startled and, I think, frightened by the implications.
Prime Minister Saint Laurent welcomes Prime Minister Churchill on his first visit to Canada since regaining power in Britain. Good-naturedly, he makes his way through Ottawa's cheering crowds as he begins a 5-day visit before returning to the United States to address a joint session of Congress.
Winston Churchill, touring the West, warned of communist subversion in Canada and every NATO country.
But these 13 men in the Kremlin have their hierarchy and a church of communist adepts whose missionaries are in every country at the fifth column. Obscure people, but awaiting the day when they hope to be the absolute masters of their fellow countrymen and pay off old scores.
They had been told that this was a fight between democracy and autocracy, and we were threatened somehow, and therefore we should be ready. And there was a tremendous amount more war propaganda in the United States, which we also received. And I can only guess that people were, what I believe, they were misled by that into thinking that we were in imminent danger of some kind of attack.
The papers reported 100,000 communists were in Canada, that Soviet agents had plotted to sabotage mines and steelworks. The RCMP kept watch. The Mounties, in time, assembled files on 21,000 people considered suspicious. By police count, the Communist Party itself was small. By the 1950s, membership had dwindled to 8,000 nationwide. Friends of Russia struggled to sell literature at 15 cents apiece and memberships for as little as 25 cents a month.
I was a loyal member, a committed member, not very zealous, it is true, but nevertheless a committed member.
Roland Penner of Winnipeg was the party's youth director. Police kept him under surveillance.
There was a huge banner across the front of our house, vote Communist, vote Tim Buck. And this being October, it was the height of the tomato season. And needless to say, the banner got its fair share of tomatoes, as did, with some regret, our neighbor's porch when the tomatoes misfired.
Tim Buck was communist leader in Canada. Born in England, he studied Marx as a tractor mechanic in Toronto. Buck dreamed of peace, progress, and socialism, a classless society in Canada, he said. The newspapers called him a Kremlin stooge. When Joseph Stalin died in 1953, Buck organized a memorial and had the Soviet dictator's portrait put in a place of honor. Stalin was a magnificent comrade, he said.
These were the bad guys who were paranoid in thinking that communists were everywhere. The fact was, there were a lot of them around.
Renamed the Labour Progressive Party, Communists commissioned this post-war campaign film. They called it A Better Canada. It remains the only film to document the party leadership. Tim Buck was shown at work at party headquarters, where he paid himself $40 a week. There was Sam Carr, national director, later a fugitive. He was jailed for conspiracy. There was Joe Salzberg, elected to the Ontario legislature. Salzberg quit the party in '57 to protest Soviet atrocities. Organizing communist women was Doris Nielsen, a parliamentarian. Nielsen served as MP for North Battleford, Saskatchewan. She, too, was watched by police.
We're always so proud of Doris Nielsen here, this school teacher from England, this beautiful, great orator. She was an ornament in the party.
Nielsen would leave the country. She spent her final years in communist China.
Behind the Iron Curtain, the most sobering threat ever to menace free men. This we know. The communists, in but 1/3 of a century, control 1/3 of the Earth's surface and 1/3 of the Earth's people. They have the A-bomb and the H-bomb. They have the jet bombers to carry them to any target in the world.
It was also deeply unsettling when I look back on it, because although we didn't have any violence, or were never exposed in the 50s to violence and these possibilities on television or in movies or games or whatever, it was real. There was a tension in the air in the Cold War, that we were living with an enemy.
Loyalty was tested by the peace movement. It was the first campaign of its kind in the 1950s. On Parliament Hill and nationwide, thousands of Canadians marched for disarmament.
The way to get peace was not their way. I don't think you'll ever get peace by disarming. I think the whole idea of disarmament invites attack.
Campaigning to destroy the bombs was the Canadian Peace Congress. Its leader was Dr. James Endicott. He was not a communist member, though some supporters were. Endicott was a First War veteran and United Church minister, a Christian, and a missionary who works for peace, he said.
I have come to the conclusion that the peace movement is the most universal and effective movement of the people that has appeared so far in history.
Endicott's peace rallies initially drew crowds by the thousands. His son, Stephen, recalls.
When he got excited, he would raise his voice and he would thunder what it was he believed in. And it was very moving to audiences.
In 1950, Endicott's Peace Congress launched a national petition drive. They proposed to ban the bomb and help outlaw war. More than 200,000 Canadians signed the petition. It was endorsed by the Communist Party. Endicott's own United Church called it propaganda and advised members not to sign.
As far as my father was concerned, he was public enemy #1. That's what the press said of him. The Winnipeg Tribune called him a Judas. And the Canadian cabinet was thinking of trying him for treason.
Dr. Endicott, who came...
Allegations of treason followed Endicott. In 1952, with Canadians at war in Korea, he traveled to Communist China. There, he accused allies of atrocities.
I have seen all kinds of incriminating evidence of American germ warfare. After seeing all this evidence, I know that the American government has carried out large-scale germ warfare on the Chinese mainland. No matter
he was creating an atmosphere that the enemy, being Soviet communism, would exploit and encourage, people to, for altruistic reasons, maybe, to betray their country.
Just released films lay bare the shocking truth behind communist charges of germ warfare in Korea and the so-called confessions of captured U.S. airmen. Confiscated films show the Red Press conferences where the American flyers admitted dropping germ bombs on civilian territory. Statements broadcast by the communist propaganda machine throughout the world and even carried into the halls of the United Nations. These confessions form the basis of a blatant symphony of hatred, documented for the first time in these films.
Oh, well, I'm angry at it. But then that's part of the struggle. Some people came and tried to set fire to our house. I wasn't there, but they set a firebomb inside the side door when a meeting was being held there.
In Moscow in 1953, Endicott went further. He was applauded at a Kremlin ceremony, awarded a Soviet Peace Medal, and a $25,000 prize. The prize was named for Joseph Stalin.
Here he is, supposed to be sort of the united front figure, right? Not a communist leader. Why would he accept the Stalin Prize? So a couple things like that. I began to be more than somewhat leery about James Endicott.
Today, my colleagues across Canada, the thousands who work in our peace movement, share the honor of the Peace Prize with me.
I despised him. I thought he was an enemy, a traitor to his country. I think he was sincere, and he was so wrong. And I think the Soviet Union propaganda used him, played him like a fiddle, like the whole peace movement.
And may this and all peace prizes have the result of being a bulwark to safeguard the future of the children of the whole world.
Why did he accept it? Well, I don't know. I didn't ask him. He was quite glad to. He felt honored to. You see, this prize was sort of like the Nobel Prize for the Eastern Bloc.
For sure, we were aware they were spying on us and presumably doing the same kind of thing in the United States and elsewhere. We simply had concrete proof of what was happening in Ottawa. So the Russians, though they had been allies in the war, clearly were not to be trusted and I guess to be feared.
An immigration officer in New York came aboard and set up an office. Actually, as I recall it, put a revolver on the desk, and one by one called us in. And what do you want? I would like a visa, I said, in my turn. He said, "We're not giving out visas to any commies. Forget it."
Warning of the communist threat to Canada, authorities nationwide took extraordinary measures to counter suspected subversion. The defector, Igor Guzenko, now living under an assumed name as an iron worker in Ontario, wrote of his bewilderment, he said, that Canadians could doubt the threat was real.
There are some things of great value that are worth dying for, so that others may truly live. That's the way my father saw things.
Quebec enforced the padlock law. It gave police powers to raid any property suspected of keeping communist literature. In Victoria, British Columbia, the works of Marx were banished from public libraries, and staff suspected of communist sympathies were fired. Victoria's mayor said he'd burn the books if he had to. Canada's largest trade unions, meeting in convention, voted to purge communist members. There would be no appeals. Labor proclaimed it was free of subversives. One union leader said, "We're serving notice on the communists. Their Russian holiday has come to an end." Leaders of the Canadian Labour Congress said trade unionists, even suspected of communist sympathies, would be ousted.
People got up and in withering tones denounced us, particularly me. One person rising and pointing a finger at me and saying, "See what happens when we send them to university."
The slightest doubt of loyalty would see civil servants fired. Security checks were run in every branch of government. Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent would not disclose how many people were investigated. He said, "It's not a question of guilt. It's a question of confidence." Parliament enacted new security laws. Any Canadian who assisted a foreign enemy could be guilty of treason.
I think we can all feel that it has been a very fruitful and important Parliament. Perhaps one of the most important since Confederation, when we consider the various measures that were adopted and which I feel quite confident are going to be of lasting benefit to the Canadian people.
Spies could be sentenced to death. The penalty remained on the books until 1976. It was never used.
I would walk back on the way home to our house in Sandy Hill. I would walk in front of the Soviet embassy, and I don't know how old I was, but I was certainly old enough to know about the Cold War and the problems with the Russians and the Soviet Union. And so I would throw stones, my way of demonstrating in favor of democracy. And it turns out that the embassy then complained. And then the police came by, and of course I took off, but the third time I did it, they caught me and they identified me, and it was, I gather it must have been an embarrassing moment at home when my father confronted me, but that was fine. I had struck a blow for democracy, and that was it.
On New Year's Day, 1956, fire destroyed the old Soviet embassy in Ottawa. Employees and their families were not injured. The building itself might have been saved, but for an incident. Diplomats refused to let firefighters enter the building. Instead, they let it burn, while staff retrieved 2 carloads of documents from the embassy. Ottawa's fire chief said the delay destroyed the embassy. He did not know the Soviets had much to hide.
There's many books published now which reveal the true intentions of Stalinist-era communists in Soviet Russia and their program, their military program. We have history on our side today.
An expose the Mitrokhin Archive published after the collapse of the USSR documented KGB espionage in Canada from the 1950s. Soviet diplomats, it said, had recruited agents and spied on members of parliament. Soviet agents photographed defense installations and plotted to sabotage natural gas pipelines in a plan called Operation Cedar. The KGB scouted Ontario's Lake of the Woods for unmarked border crossings into the United States.
You were speaking about a person who was not only a dictator, but a despot and in fact, a mass murderer. You know, one knew that later, and when one came to know that later, and then recollect that you spoke glowingly of this person at an earlier time, you say, oh no, why did I do that? How could I do that? So, yes, of course there was a sense of shame.
There is pride in the newly won right to wear the scarlet tunic of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. There is pride in the precision of clicking heels and swinging arms. There is confidence and authority in heads held high. There is humility in the tradition of a great force.